You're listening to Energy Insiders, a weekly update on clean energy and climate policy with Renew Economy's editor Giles Parkinson and leading energy analyst David Leach. Energy Insiders is brought to you by Evergen, providing cutting-edge energy management software for battery optimisation, virtual power plants and distributed energy resources. And Pylon, helping solar installers and retailers design high-resolution solar proposals in minutes.
Hello and welcome to this latest episode of the Energy Insiders podcast. My name is Giles Parkinson. I'm the editor-in-chief of Renew Economy and editor of its sister site, the EV Focused Driven. And joining me, as usual, but not quite as usual, is ITK Principal David Leach. David, buying an electric car wasn't enough for you. You've now got a dog as well.
I've had a dog pretty much for a large part of my life, but this is the new addition. Checkers here is a very enthusiastic audience member, and instead of an autograph, I said he could make a guest appearance, but I'll let him go now because he's very bored and he loves listening to stuff about electricity. He'd probably be rather outside playing in the rain, but he can't do that either, so it's a bit sad.
Or rounding up sheep. What is he there?
Oh, yes, he can round up sheep, but he's a bit small. If you let him loose on a cow or something, I'm not sure who'd be the winner, but don't think he would be.
What is it? It looks like a border collie.
That's a Sheltie. Karen said we couldn't have any more big dogs, which was quite reasonable. And I wasn't going to get a dog at all. And then, of course, I walked past a couple of these in Roseville, and there we go.
Well, that's an unusual introduction to our podcast today. Data centers. We're going to have, we've done an interview about data centers. I thought it was really very interesting, and we'll get to that shortly. But, and we'll come back after that to discuss the news of the week. And I guess the main bit is the ESOO, the Electricity Statement of Opportunities from AEMO, which seems to be relatively benign. But David, we won't get into that now. At your suggestion, we interviewed or had a chat with Andrew Walton from Walton Advisory about data centers because it's a pretty big part of the electricity equation at the moment.
It's a big part of the electricity talk at the moment, Giles, yes.
Quite so. Okay, without further ado, let's have a listen to our interview with Andrew Walton. Andrew Walton, thank you very much for joining us on Energy Insiders.
Thanks very much for having me. It's a bit of an honour and a privilege to be here.
Look, data centres have kind of been this sort of the topic du jour. If I can throw in a bit of half-assed French, everyone's talking about it.
Topic of the year. No, what do you mean? Of the day, Giles. But anyway, sorry.
No, it's just an expression, David. But anyway, I'll forge on. AEMO's come and talked about data centres in its latest ESOO forecast, its 10-year sort of outlook on grid reliability. It was a big feature of Transgrid's transmission report. It was a big feature of the VicGrid transmission report. So a lot to talk about, Andrew, but why don't you just start off by telling us...
Oh, and Andrew, before you do, sorry to interrupt, Giles, I just wanted to ask, are you saying that data centres have replaced hydrogen as the topic du jour, just so I can know where this competition is?
Well, yeah, it was really interesting seeing in Transgrid's report, basically, a year ago it was forecasting 5 terawatt hours of hydrogen demand, and now it's forecasting basically almost nothing. And a year ago, it was forecasting almost nothing of data demand, and now it's forecasting 5 terawatt hours. So I'll be interested to see what Andrew thinks of this. But Andrew, why don't you just start off by telling us who you are and what you do and what you know about data centers?
Yeah. Well, thanks very much for having me on again. So I guess by way of background, I did a commerce law degree a while ago at Melbourne University, and when I graduated from that, probably because I worked at Dick Smith part-time, I got a job in the tech and telco team at Macquarie. That was a good place to cut your teeth. I worked then at a sort of a boutique strategic consulting / M&A firm in Melbourne, which had two really important clients for later in the story. One of them was a wind turbine manufacturer / developer, which is where I've sort of developed my skills in the energy industry. And the other one was a company called NextGen Networks, which was a large sort of backbone telecommunications network in Australia, which had an ancillary business or associated business with it called Metro Data Centers, which was later acquired by Equinix. So that's what I started learning about the data center industry, which is it's got quite a steep learning curve, but it's a very, very interesting asset type. Time moved on, and I spent, did the typical young Australian thing, did my tour of duty in the UK, where I worked for a company over there called Octopus Investments. And then when my wife and I returned home, Octopus decided to open its doors in Melbourne. It's at precisely the same time, one of those times of serendipity, precisely the same time that I was returning home. They gave us 3 months to sort of get a business case away and get the business going. They've now been there for 7 years. Sam's done a wonderful job there. And then after about 3 years there, the gentleman that was the managing director of Metro, back when I used to advise them, sort of came and plucked me out of Octopus Investments, because they needed sort of an energy/investments guy to work with him, someone that he trusted. He could foresee that as part of the data center construction, the data center business model, energy was starting to become a more prevalent factor. So that was like, I happily sort of jumped across and worked with the management team there. Sort of a very strange role, but like it was sort of semi-commercial and semi-operational. I would do things like negotiate energy contracts to energy connections, stuff like that. And sort of also do customer contracts. So to understand exactly what the end users of those data centers really wanted out of the product they were purchasing off DCI. And then 4 years was a good duration, a good term there. And recently I've sort of stepped out on my own and sort of I've started my own consulting business that sort of operates between the space between data centers and energy. And now I find myself talking to you guys.
Well, and we're very glad to have you on. So, on the basis of all that, that seems that you're fully qualified to continue on this podcast, and that's good to know. Look, what's your? I mean, we've seen. What do you make of these forecasts on data centers and things like that? What are you telling your clients about the possibilities in Australia for data center? I mean, how big are they? How much demand are we likely to see?
Well, it's this kind of like a push and pull that's sort of going on in whether Australia captures its, shall we say, fair share or greater than fair share of the data center market. We've got a lot of tailwinds and we've got a lot of headwinds as well. Part of the challenge there is that the data center industry itself is evolving very, very quickly. And it's sort of like a microcosm of the world writ large.
Yes, it was news to transcript.
Yeah, well, it's interesting that the end user customers of data, so if you compare the 10 years Metronode to sort of DCI, the end user customers of data centers have been changing through time, and it's been sort of consolidating. So you end up having sort of you're facing a narrow amount of market share. And nowadays, as the business sort of stands today, the hyperscalers are the biggest guys in town, right? But we all hear about the AI revolution that's going to be coming upon us very, very soon. And so a lot of the future, that's going to determine a lot of the future growth of both the energy demand and the megawatts that are in Australia. But an AI data center, by necessity, is sort of, it's very, very different and greater in scale than a hyperscale data center, which in itself is quite different to a co-located data center or co-location.
So Andrew, let's just get a few bits and pieces straight for our audience and ourselves, so that we can talk in standard terms. And maybe I was going to start with the global market, but let's just start in Australia. How many megawatt data centers are measured in terms of their electricity power consumption capacity in typically megawatts, aren't they, as a general rule? How many megawatts or gigawatts of data center capacity do we actually have in Australia?
About 1,300 is sort of the rough number that gets used by companies like Morgan Stanley. So that's today, or as of 2024. So there's about 1,300 megawatt of installed capacity in Australia at the moment. And that's predicted to sort of grow at about a 16% CAGR up until that 2030. So you'd have about 3.2 gigawatts on the grid.
And for anyone else's general information, there's about between 2 and 3 gigawatts, 1,000 megawatts of aluminium smelting capacity in Australia, which traditionally has been the biggest consumer of electricity. But of that 1,300 megawatts, it doesn't actually run at 100% capacity utilization, does it?
That's absolutely correct. And it's also, that number has to be both grossed up and then sort of discounted down. So it has to be grossed up in the sense that to support, say, 1 megawatt of ICT or server load within a data center, you actually have a bunch of ancillary equipment around it to cool it and sort of house it in a very secure environment. We call that sort of the PUE factor. So typical PUE factors are about 1.25 to 1.3. It depends on the underlying technology of the data center. So you have to gross up those.
So that's the power use efficiency or something, is it?
That's correct. That's correct. And a good data center has a lower PUE number that approaches 1.
Yes, but say 1.3. So for when you say 1,300 megawatts, you're talking processor capacity.
That's correct.
And
yes,
its actual demand on the electricity system is more like 1.6 gigawatts or something like
correct.
that.
That's correct. But when your customer moves their server into the data hall, and they connect it up to the A power stream and the B power stream, it's a bit like driving a car. You don't floor it at 100% all the way every day, all the time. And so you typically find, in my experience at least, when those customers sort of reach a steady state, they typically consume at around about 55% or 60% utilization factor for the capacity that they're paying for the power that they're paying for.
So that means that broadly in Australia, as of 2024, there's about 800 megawatts of capacity being used 100% of the time.
That's one way to think about it. Yes, correct.
Which is broadly equivalent to the electricity consumed at the Tomago smelter, if for want of a better word, or maybe Boyne Island. But anyway, it's equivalent to an aluminium smelter's worth of power right now. And as you say, it's growing quite quickly. Now, before we get onto these very exciting large language models and stuff, in fact, most data centers in Australia do far more prosaic tasks like, I don't know, keeping data in the cloud or that sort of stuff for businesses or governments. I mean, what are data centers used for traditionally here in Australia?
Well, there's sort of a neat, if you looked at a typical data center fleet at the moment, from a data center operator, they'd probably be split between a co-located data center and a hyperscaler data center. And they're quite different in terms of what the servers within those two different data centers do. Co-location is sort of what most people might think of the traditional data center. And that's when you might have had a business, let's just call it random business, call it Renew Economy, for example. They needed to host a server in the corner of their room. They put it in a rack. On that server rack, there was sort of some hard drive storage. There was probably an email server, and it lived in the corner of the office, and it needed the phone line to survive. So eventually that got moved out of the corner office and moved into a data center or co-located data center, so it could have a much more sort of stable operating comms environment and a stable operating electricity environment. But importantly, where the co-location aspect comes in, other companies would put their racks in the same hall, and you would share a pooled amount of redundancy that the data center operator would provide to all the customers within that data hall. Fast forward 5, 6, 7 years, as you get larger customers, which you call the hyperscalers, they said, I don't want to share the hall with people anymore. I would like to buy the whole hall off you, and I'll put my much more specialized equipment inside that hall, and they may take up more than one rack space at a time. And what's really driven that is the way that individuals have consumed IT services, if you like. These days, we tend to use things like a Microsoft Office 365, whereas previously you would have had like local copies installed on your computer. Now you might use web-based applications because that is an easier and more simplified deployment model for those companies that would provide you those services. And so you've seen this number of customers of a typical data center has been reducing through time.
And so those data centers where the hyperscale, and I'm not quite sure whether hyper is really justified, but let's not go there. They would have used more like general purpose computing chips rather than the kind of machine language or learning chips like NVIDIA chips and things like that.
Yes, without getting too complicated, they would still probably use serial-based x86 processing, which was the backbone of sort of like, the Microsoft server product. So we're not talking quite yet into sort of the parallel computing world, which is more heavily associated with AI. We're just talking about economies of scale and somewhat virtualized services, where it's about a gross amount of processing power to have a cloud product.
Now, if we just what's the growth rate in those traditional sectors of the market? Is that where the 16% growth is still coming from?
The 16% is still seen as the aggregate. You would have thought the majority of growth would have be actually at the AI level, as I understand the numbers.
That's right. So these traditional data center uses in Australia and probably in other countries, which I'll come to, would essentially be have a slower growth rate in excess of GDP growth, but probably at a single digit rate. Would you say?
I'd agree with that, but I think what's sort of happening there is that people get attracted to the latest shiny object, and the shiny object is AI. So if you actually look at these big tech companies,
Yeah. I'll come back to the AI. I just want to get to it slowly.
yeah, I agree with you saying. Yes, correct.
And then another. Now let's talk about where they're located and why. So these traditional data centers, really electricity consumption is an important variable cost, but it's not the biggest part of their total cost stack. The biggest part of the total cost stack is probably the computer depreciation, really, when you talk about it.
Yeah, that is part of the driver of actually putting these devices within the data center itself, because you want it to be in a safe, maintained, climate-controlled environment where the product has as long an operating life as possible. So if you put yourself in the shoes of a data center client, right, the most expensive thing for them will be buying the actual equipment itself and getting their hands on the chips at the right time and the right type of server architecture. And then when they then start interacting with the data center company, traditionally, the next most important cost was the rent, which we confusingly call the power charge, but it's a power density charge. That's most akin to renting the space in the data center to put the servers in. And then further on is the actual energy charge when the electrons run through those.
Okay, let's not worry about the energy charge at the moment. So something I haven't quite realized with these co-located ones, the actual equipment still belongs to the customer.
That's correct. That's absolutely correct. So the data center operator is more akin to a landlord to some extent, which is where you get, yeah.
And would this still be the case in a hyperscale center?
Well, it depends. There's a contractual relationship between the data center operator and the data center user, but when you end up having a data center which has sort of one key user, and you know it's going to have one key user or two, you end up that they get involved much more heavily in the design stage with what they call the spec for that. So it's a much more customized building. So rather than a one size fits all and everyone brings their small server racks in, we can then optimize the data center much earlier in the development process, and therefore that client is able to have a sort of a build to suit data center for their specific hyperscale purposes.
That's right. And then so in this case, because the clients, and there are lots of clients, maybe in a data center, a co-located one, or it's probably you're going to want to locate that data center close to where all the IT guys can come in after breakfast and have a look at the server and give it a nice pat or whatever they do.
Yeah, and so part of what the data center operator there is trying to do is they have the security lists of certain techs that can come in and out, and there's all these pretty highly regulated regimes of who could actually go in the data center. There's access control and things like that, because you do have that fundamental problem. Like if I get into that co-located data center where Renew Economy's server is sitting, that's a security concern, right? So it is about actually being close to the populace, because you actually need the hands and feet to service those servers.
And another thing is that Australia is an island, as John Dunn might have said, but not on. And really, we also have to think about all the telcos stuff that gets in as well as the power. But that relative to building electricity lines, building fiber optic cable is quite cheap, and there's plenty of it in the major capital cities, and the latency times, even to Asia and the US, are not that bad. Is that a fair statement?
Yeah, I mean, but back in the days when I advised NextGen Networks, they sort of kicked off a project called the Australia-Singapore cable, which linked Perth to Singapore. And it's interesting, you've touched on really important aspects of the history of data centers there. Data centers traditionally grew up as sort of an ancillary device to those, or ancillary building to those telecommunications networks. And traditionally, data centers were what we called closed data centers. They didn't really have carrier neutral point of view. So if you wanted to put your server in a data center, you went to Telstra because Telstra would give both your comms and your data center space. And then at the time of Metronode coming up, they had what's called a carrier neutral data center. So you could access all the carriers in the Meet Me room. And that sort of has spurred on people being able to pick and choose which data centers they put their servers in because they're no longer bound to a particular carrier for their comms. But it is sort of true that like there is a lot of sort of fiber optic capacity in Australia, and there's a lot of, shall we say, submarine fiber optic connectivity to the rest of the world, which becomes an important place if we want to capture some of the world's data on our shores.
That's right. And before moving on to LLMs, which I'm coming to shortly, it was put to me years and years ago by someone who might know such stuff that, in fact, one reason why really big global companies might be hesitant about storing a whole bunch of global data in Australia was because they didn't really like our metadata laws. I'm not sure how valid or not that is, or whether you have an opinion about it.
I haven't really have a fully thought through opinion on those sort of items, to be honest, but data security and data sovereignty has been a topic that's quite
Debated.
has been quite heavily debated, but it really depends on who the actual end user might be, particularly the whole data sovereignty thing, and that actually more goes to, from a data center aspect, what equipment sits inside the data center itself. So certain telecommunications devices are banned from certain data. You've got to use servers from a certain country. They're manufactured in a certain country. So sort of more goes to that sort of, the security is sort of built from like, zero trust level security all the way up in terms of all the way through the design of any given data center, if it wants to be seen as accredited to holding data of a particular level. And some clients will demand that.
That's right. And some clients mightn't want the government being able to access their metadata no matter what. But let's not spend any more time on that. Let's go on to now where all the excitement's coming from, which is the extra growth surge that comes from AI or large language models. And so the kind of data center that's required, let's just talk about the basics, the kind of computer that is required for learning models is really very different to the general purpose Intel computer. It typically is very good at doing parallel processing, and it turns out that the chips that were originally made for gaming or displays by NVIDIA are the kind of chips that you have to have for this kind of learning models. Is that right?
Yeah, you've sort of hit the nail on the head there, David. Although the NVIDIA story is a little bit more, it's a bit broader than that. The NVIDIA is in about the third iteration of its company life, where the first iteration was the old graphics cards. But yeah, it's these days that it's NVIDIA is sort of the tech you'll find within the data hall. And so where NVIDIA's done a very, very good job at capturing a particular part of the market share, is that it is their technology that now gets put into the large AI data centers to support essentially the parallel processing cores. But the data center that has like an NVIDIA setup inside it looks vastly, vastly different to a rack-based data center as you would traditionally design it, to the extent that NVIDIA are managing to capture the whole value chain within the data center itself. So you wouldn't even have, for example, Ethernet cables within some NVIDIA-based data centers, because they've embedded their own higher capacity style cables.
And the reason for this is that there's such a lot of parallel learning going on that the communications between the racks and is so important to get that speed of it exactly right, and to get the density and power density and so on and so forth.
Yeah, that's correct. So a lot of the innovation happens at the rack, or the sort of inside the hall level, and so NVIDIA are responsible for that, and they have the world leading product. And then all the companies that are developing the AI models want to use the fastest and latest technology, right?
And we won't talk about the Tensor or CUDA sort of kind of software that actually is used for the training. But the point is, these data centers, well, let me start. Does Australia have any such data centers, or even parts of existing data centers that are arranged this way?
Well, as I understand it, we do have elements of the computing power that can do those sort of calculations scattered about in certain data centers in small instances. But do we have a large 500 megawatt AI data center sitting in Australia?
No, we know the answer to that is no.
Yeah, that's correct. But that is what we're trying to prove ourselves as the place that, when the Americans decide that the next place to put a large AI data center, that we want that to come to Australia. That's sort of the end goal.
But at the moment, right? I mean, if we look around the world, and this is where I could have asked at the beginning, but I wanted to cover these basics before we got there. If we look around the world, the places where these centers have been built in the first instance is China and regions of the USA, a little bit in Europe, and then if we were to come down, maybe there's people in places like Malaysia that think that they're well capable of delivering that kind of solution. Firstly, as to where the investment is today, have I got it sort of right?
Yeah, that's well, the Americans are the ones who are leading the way. It's their companies that are sort of developing the AI models, and they've got multiple companies competing against each other to invent the best style AI model. The Chinese, to my knowledge, are sort of responding to that to do their own sort of homegrown style models in response to the Americans. So they're trying to keep up with the tech race. When it came to where data centers would be located outside the USA, the reason Malaysia was seen to have shall we say, an advantage was it was close to Singapore, but Singapore itself had a moratorium on data centers. I mean, Singapore is a small nation state
It doesn't actually have much power, Singapore. That's one of its problems. But go on.
That's correct, yeah. They haven't got much land or power, right? And if they did have it, it'd be to support the population. But across the strait, that's if you could locate data centers there that are within, a relatively short time in terms of latency, that's where it's being driven as that ancillary.
So just off the top of your head, are you aware of any like greater than 100 megawatt data centers for use of LLMs that have actually been built or are being built in Malaysia?
No, not off the top of my head, but I must admit I haven't run the microscope over that particular jurisdiction.
Okay, so again, if I'm reading, what I learn is that as you go up the scale where you've got these large language models with parallel processing, there's a lot about it, but all of a sudden the fact of being close to all your customers doesn't matter because you've only got one customer typically, and all of a sudden your power demand is way higher, so being located. And I think, comes even in traditional data centers in terms of variable cost, energy, electricity can be 80% of total costs. But once you get to these really big things, I mean, other than the depreciation on the NVIDIA processors, the H100s or whatever they are, electricity cost is just about, and cooling cost is just about everything, isn't it?
Well, it's in terms of what you can control when you're operating. Yeah, that's correct. So that's why at the get-go, you want to have a data center designed with a low PUE. So it's the most efficient in terms of actually powering your chips. But then the input cost that they've got to face is the cost per kilowatt hour, effectively. So that's when you look at the things that they can control in terms of total cost of ownership, a low cost energy jurisdiction is to be preferred over a higher cost one, that's for sure.
That's right. Although, again, just while we're talking about this from a business perspective rather than an electricity perspective, I understand that if you've got a choice of, you can go out, that there are some people that build these data centers just for anyone to come along and say, I'll rent you for a year or so and use you to train my model and stuff, and then I might run it somewhere else. Or you can have your Google or your Meta guys or whoever it is come along and say, we're going to build and own and operate it for ourselves. You've got a couple of different competing business models there, haven't you?
Yeah, that's correct. So even if you're a hyperscaler, or if you own a data center which is a hyperscaler, you've always got the specter that if you price your deals incorrectly, your customer can be your competitor. But I think one of the things that's important to realize, there is a belief that in the AI world that you might be able to locate the training-based data centers at a different place to the inferencing-based ones. So ones that are more latency dependent have to be closer to the population source where the would use the output. But when you actually have training style data centers, which are more about, brute force calculations, or that's probably not the right way of expressing it, but massive amounts of computations where energy is a key input, then that's where you're looking to sort of optimize the energy equation, and when latency is less dependent. So you could look at locating them in different areas of, say, Australia, for example.
That's right. And so when you look on a global scale, if you were to do so, and you're sitting in the United States and you say, for one reason or another, we'd like to build a data center somewhere else, where would Australia rate?
Oh, that's a very, very vexed question. Depends on who you ask, I would think.
Well, I'm asking you.
I think in the sense that Australia is a strong ally of the US, that we're a Western liberal society, that we have sort of a stable operating environment, and our energy grid is quite reliable. We would rate very highly on that aspect, and the fact that some of those companies are already here, we'd rate very highly on that basis. I would have thought that, having had a look at the latest quarterly energy dynamics and where the wholesale prices sort of trended upwards over the years relative to its historic cost base, then it's not quite as attractive. And if you have someone in the United States who has a particular home bias, particularly with the way they've delivered power to these data centers, as they've seen to have sponsored more sort of gas-fired generation, if they go, well, that's the ultimate business model, that we team up a AI data center with a gas-fired generator to sort of support the energy load, then that's a difficult question for Australia. So part of the task going forward is going to be convincing these customers that the Australian energy grid is as resilient as that, despite the fact that it's got a different subset of generation technologies.
On the other hand, if you look, I've seen quotes for gas generation in the United States for brownfield gas generation in the United States, where the capital cost is over $2 million a megawatt. It actually is a pretty expensive power source in and of itself, even before you start to think of the carbon emissions side of things. But I don't want to get too much into that, because the relative power cost changes too with currency depreciation and all sorts of things. I guess what I'm asking is, now if I look at it, is there that's from the overseas players, but it's not likely that any. What do you think about the prospects of the Australian government, as usual, having just saved a whole lot of money on the NDIS? They can now reinvest. They could just reinvest it in a data center, or is there some Australian corporate that's falling over itself to build a data center, of I don't know, greater than 100 megawatts capacity in Australia? I mean, a 500 megawatt data center. Do you see any realistic prospects of such a thing?
I think there's a lot of data center operators that would like to build data centers of that scale, which will be necessary to build them of that size to be economic. But in terms of the user of those data centers, then they typically come with a USA flag on the back. And that's the real challenge.
Or a China flag, let's be honest. I mean, China can't, to get another little wrinkle, China can't import these NVIDIA chips, can they, very easily? So, anyway.
That's correct. But I think if they realize where those chips are going, the export controls will be put on pretty quickly.
All right. So, all that said, I mean, it seems to me that the kind of 16, it's pretty risky, isn't it? I mean, like we've talked about the traditional data center usage growing at, single digits. I put that number out there, and you didn't want to disagree with it too much. But we've got this overall growth of 16%, which is close enough to double. So there seems to be kind of a bet that somehow or other this demand for this AI in Australia, or learning, is somehow going to double data center demand.
Yeah, but I think that's when you sort of scratch below the surface and sort of go, well, what's actually driving the way that we're going to use computers in the future? And bearing in mind that the Transformer paper is only 8 years old. It was written in 2017, but AI seems becoming more and more pervasive in terms of everyday life. And really the ultimate question is going to be is
But if you use ChatGPT 5, I mean, it's hopeless. It's worse than ChatGPT 4. I use Claude Code all the time, but I just had ChatGPT 5 hallucinate something to me today. I was just it just completely made it up, and I had to make it do a web search to prove to itself.
well, but there will be the challenge of how much we trust the product, and that's the real challenge that these AI businesses have in terms of like what is now getting beyond the shiny new object phase, and is now going to move into ways that it can meaningfully increase our productivity.
Oh, so let's talk about this a little bit more. Sorry, I'm jumping about the topic. So we talk 16% and 9%, and the difference comes down to the fact that businesses can be expected to demand to use services like ChatGPT or specialized agents to change the way they do work, and it's going to lift productivity in a wonderful way. I was just reading some Goldman Sachs research and listening to a podcast where they say that 3 years in, the impacts on employment and even productivity in the United States have been pretty minimal. You can see that some younger software engineers haven't done as well in the short term. It's just kind of interesting, but also sometimes it takes a long time for big shifts like this to get responded to. But despite all the claims, and it doesn't seem to me like this AI is necessarily, well, certainly not as big as, say, discovering electricity or motor cars.
Well, I mean, you have to sort of look at it sort of let's think of a historical prism of the last 25 years, or I guess in my lifetime. You've got one interesting aspect now that the people who are generally in charge of the US tech companies would within the lifespan have observed the dot-com boom. So that tends to have an asymmetric payoff. You either do very, very well out of it, or your business fails completely. But you've got to make the bet to be at the table. You got to be in the room where it happens. So, there was a time when the dot-com boom took off, and then anyone that had a dot-com got a premium on their valuation, and then those that some survived, some didn't.
So back in the day when I was at the beginning, it must have been about 2006. You could have chosen to be a Yahoo investor or an Amazon investor. And my prediction was Yahoo, and that Amazon would never make it. That's how good I am at predictions. Go on.
Well, they can be kind of coin flips, and we can talk about it on our Nokia phones or discuss it on our Blackberries later on. You know what I mean? Some companies survived and some didn't. And then the second real one that sort of came in, which is about 2008, 2009, was when the iPhone hit our pockets. And you sort of looked at it and goes, well, isn't this great? It can make phone calls. It's a music player, and it can guess what music's on. And then,
I knew that was a winner from the day one. That was never a doubt.
But if you told me it would revolutionize, it would destroy the taxi industry, because Uber was able to use that platform and over-the-top communications. Some people would have predicted that for sure, but many people didn't. One of the interesting observations was when the submarine fiber optic cables were being built. Traditionally, the business model for them was, Qantas. Like, it's a bit like a airline route. It was like Qantas and American Airlines would exchange the route, and they would dominate that trans-Pacific route. And Telstra and AT&T would fund the cable and control it. But as those new cables came into existence, suddenly, when we're doing the book build for it, suddenly US tech company number 1 turned up, and US tech company number 2. It's like, well, why do they need capacity? It was a very interesting time. Like, why are they the ones now funding this cable and not your traditional telecommunications network? But they were building the telecommunication company killers, right? They were building the over-the-top apps using these new platforms. So
I remember Roy Mahay's law that, people tend to overhype the use of stuff in the short term and underestimate how strong it's going to be longer term. So is it your contention that we can double the level of data center growth rate because businesses will find ways to use the technology that are going to enhance productivity? And by enhanced productivity, I don't mean sacking people. I mean getting more output and making people's lives better for the same amount of overall inputs.
I think some companies that are quick to adapt and have the right scale to adapt to those technologies will be the beneficiaries. One of those observations I've had when I've gone to check with one of my friends runs a company with about 30 employees, and I actually went and asked him that very question because I was curious, like, are you using AI as like a more productive search engine, or is it, something a little bit more? And he sort of took me behind like where all these servers were and explained how they had lost an employee and they tried to virtualize their function, right? And in that, they managed to use the AI tools to sort of recreate and sort of make a much more efficient middle office, right? But that required the company not to be too big before you could implement it across the whole company-wide organization. But to some extent, we're not going to get too much of a choice about using the AI tools. I mean, you just have to look at perhaps Microsoft Office and how that, if you have a cloud-based instance of Microsoft Office, you might have noticed that that's been evolving relatively rapidly. And suddenly,
I don't use Microsoft. I'm a Python and open source guy.
there you go. But yeah, you'll find that like, or if you try to use Google search, suddenly there's an AI response ahead of your old search query. So it's sort of, there's a bit of like the user's got to go towards it, but there's a bit of like the company puts it out there directly in front of your eyeballs to sort of to start using and make you experiment with it. And then, you can look at the hallucinated answers and try to make up your mind.
So I'd like to bring it back to sort of the grid in Australia, and I've got a couple of questions here. One is we've heard from a few renewable energy developers, and AGL even mentioned it in their annual report, buried somewhere quite deep, that talk about data centers and where they would be placed. Some renewable energy developers in sort of stranded zones are hoping desperately the data centers will come to them and use their power. What's the likelihood of that?
It's a really interesting question, Charles. So you sort of go through the thought process going, well, if one of the central tenets of data center location was latency and proximity to population, and if that starts breaking down, then what are the other key tenets in sort of site selection? And you go, well, if I don't need to be like in near the Sydney West bulk supply point, which is the most sort of crowded substation from that perspective, I'm going to move out to where shall we say, the LCOEs should be dropping, in the sense that the irradiation is better and the wind blows faster. So therefore, the inverted commas, the firmed energy cost is cheaper. And that sort of naturally draws your eyes towards the red zones, because that's where all the renewable energy developers are moving to. But you still have the reality there that another central tenet of data center selection is that you're grid connected, right? So you, as part of your overall energy charges, you're going to have the, shall we say, at the very least, the transmission style costs for being connected. Or you're asking those renewable developers.
Just technically, can I say, if you were behind the within 1 kilometre of the Dinnerwin South substation or any other substation, Dinnerwin's in the southwest zone, there's no transmission connection cost if you're within 1 kilometre, but you would still be connected.
Yeah, but that's where the interesting opportunities sort of come up. It's almost like case by case basis. So it is that sort of aspect of like, or would you ask the renewable developer to not connect some of their generators to the grid, right, and try to do sort of stuff behind the meter, if you like?
That's an interesting idea, because the economist Paul Krugman wrote a article just a few days ago talking about data centers, talking about their impact on the grid, raising concerns about the cost of the all this stuff that needs to be built for the data centers will eventually, well, could fall onto other consumers. And he was suggesting that, well, maybe they should be built off grid. Maybe they should bring their own resources.
Well, that's where it becomes the sort of the way of doing things, or the central tenets of actually how a data center operates, becomes quite an interesting argument. Because if you ask a traditional data center operator, they get very nervous once if one of the two sort of connections into a data center fails, and suddenly you're running at a slightly less level of redundancy. They start getting very, very nervous, because the way the contractual suites all work, and the penalties if you don't supply your services. So you get this sort of weird world where you go, well, what happens instead of assuming that the data centers pull energy from the grid, and then they have their own backup as on-site generation? What if the on-site generation is the primary and the grid is the backup, right? So you sort of start flipping the logic of it all. But then you realize you've got to go to end customers and understand whether they're happy with that style of arrangement. And the only thing that's going to get them to move the dial is if the overall total cost of ownership is lower, right? So you've got to be able to offer a cheaper energy price than if you were grid connected. So there's sort of that sort of trade-off between the two metrics. And if it's not, they're just going to go, well, can you build it in the old traditional way? Thank you very much. Because I'd much rather value the connection security than the overall energy costs, believe it or not.
And from your assessment, what do you think the opportunity is for Australia to deliver a lower cost supply to data centers?
Well, what's the line? Like we've got, the sun on our back, the sun on our shoulders and the wind at our back. So like, if you look at some of the LCOEs, look at some of the LCOEs that we can build in some areas of the country, then it is actually quite interesting. But at the same time, you would have to look at the overall spec that the data centers may require. So that if they start saying, well, in concession for the fact that I'm getting a much, much lower energy cost, I'm willing to relax my SLAs somewhat, that might be a winner, right? Because you then batteries start coming into the equation as well, right? I mean, you interviewed the CEO of Acacia recently, and battery costs are coming down, right? So we have to look at how that factors in all how we'd supply these guys as well.
So, and another, sorry, Giles, I apologise, but another thing that's very important is how interruptible are these data centres. I mean, we know that sometimes they just pause and you get this huge drop in demand without necessarily wanting it. But if you had a controlled direction to reduce load, can they do it?
I think if you've got a modern enough data center with the right type of SCADA and you'd had them sort of participating, I think that's more than possible. Although the standard way that a data center, like the cheapest way that you'd actually supply or do the energy supply in a data center operator is like, well, if we're having trouble with the grid, we'll just disconnect, thanks very much, and go on to generators, because that's what the job is, right? Like the job of the data center operator is to keep the servers happy, right? Come, hell or high water, to use the expression. It's never really sort of, and this is mainly because they were so small relative to the rest of the grid. So as they get bigger and bigger, right, as a relative percentage of the power draw off the grid, they become a bigger participant, right? But in the world of the 5 megawatts and 10 megawatt data centers, they would sort of figure like they could trip off the grid without much effect, right? And so no one was really being harmed. But in the world where it's 100 meg that's instantaneously being pulled off, that has much greater repercussions for everyone else in the local, in the nearby area.
And I think that's why the battery storage developers and some of the battery project owners are, see great possibilities in this. And AGL actually had an interesting graph in their latest reports, just sort of showing how battery can sort of smooth out. Apart from those really big bursts in machine learning, but that's probably beyond my pay grade. I've just got one final question. I think I've asked this question before, but I can't remember who I asked it of. Is why Ireland suddenly got a sort of a steam ahead? Because apparently that's accounting for about 20% of its grid.
Ireland is a really, really interesting case. I mean, everyone used the acronym FLAP, which is I think Frankfurt, London, Amsterdam, and Paris, and now it's FLAP-D. Like, so you add the Dublin to it. It's Ireland's sort of the unique case. It's in the EU. A lot of, shall we say, tax structuring takes place in Ireland in terms of the ways that those multinationals are already managing their affairs. It's the first, if you're building a transatlantic cable from America to somewhere in Europe, it would be the first getting off point, if you like. And they speak English, right? So there's also that. So I think you can see how Ireland has managed to, and it's not without their own problems. Like they have sort of made comments like, now they're starting to form a bigger part of their grid. But Ireland's a really good example of how a country can leverage either its geographic or natural advantages or regulatory advantages to attract these companies to those shores.
But I think Ireland's power demand is not much different to South Australia's either, in total. I might have that wrong, but it's not a really big grid.
Yeah. I'd have to check the exact numbers myself, David. So
I don't know the answer to that. Andrew, this has been a fascinating discussion. I learned more about data centers than I ever thought I ever would learn, but there you go. The industry scares me, though, with its acronyms. But look, thank you very much, David. Unless you've got any last questions?
No, I'd like to say thanks to her. I hope this is not the last time we talk about data centers and LNMs. It's I like talking about the world of that world. There's a lot to talk about, more than we can cover, despite an excellent introduction from Andrew.
It'll be interesting if we meet again in 2 years' time and actually see whether the predictions about how we use AI, actually take place. Maybe we'll be using, I don't know, synthetic or synthetic versions ourselves to talk to each other.
Well,
you know?
I use Claude Code, which is Anthropic's. It's a split off if you're interested. I mean, it is very interesting, the actual economics of the data center owners, like ChatGPT. I mean, or I think the one that's owned by Elon Musk is dropping $1 billion a month at the moment. So, I mean, of cash, that's it's a big stakes game. But I mean, I personally use Claude Code every single day. I couldn't do what I do without it anymore, and that's only taken a year.
I have absolutely no idea what you're talking about, but I'm going to get my Android to talk to your Android, and we'll fix up another interview in a couple of years' time. So thank you very much, Andrew.
Thanks so much for your time, guys.
And that was Andrew Walton from Walton Advisory. David, fascinating stuff. I don't think I understood half of it, but it's my children are still amazed I actually managed to sign onto a computer each morning and switch it on. So data centers is probably a bit beyond my pay grade, but it is really interesting. As you said before the interview, it's talked about, and we're yet to see how it actually transpires.
It is interesting. Data centers have tremendous potential, and I think they're a lot more real in some ways. A lot more immediate than the hydrogen kind of thing, but also subject to this great hope because everyone wants to have this massive new source of electricity demand, and data centers provide that. And the actual facts and the truths of what the data centers are up to.
Checkers is walking off with your carpet. For those on the video call, that's quite funny.
Anyway, the point is there's a lot to learn about data centers, and they're part of a complex industry in which electricity plays a big part. And you can't really understand the future of data centers without understanding a little bit about large language models, artificial intelligence, the great steps forward that it's made in the past couple of years, but also understanding that so much has happened in a short space of time that it's still very hard to tell where we're going to end up within the space.
Absolutely. And it's fascinating to see just the change. I mean, you mentioned at the start of that interview about Transgrid and how it's just completely flipped its forecasts. We've seen AEMO preparing us for the very same thing with their next ISP. We've gone from sort of green hydrogen exports to sort of electric superpower to green industry. So it kind of chops and changes, and a lot of the hype that sort of just kind of dissipates. Data centers seem to be a bit more real, and it did feature actually in the ESOO report, which despite a forecast, reasonably sizable increase in sort of annual demand between now and 2035, up 25% from previous forecasts, I think, or 21% was it? It's reasonably benign, but things do have to get built.
Look, the main thing I looked at in the ESOO that caught my eye immediately, in fact, I went straight to, I think it's about page 45, to look at the schedule of coal closures, because that's what that's one of two things that are of actual interest at the moment, and they still have and will have until someone tells them differently, someone officially tells them differently, Eraring closing in 2027, and Yallourn West, Yallourn closing in 2028, and then they have Callide B as the next closure after that. And then if you look at their actual graph, they have every other coal generator except maybe Mount Piper closing in 2033, I think it is. So that's the situation that we have and that they're dealing with, and they're saying that we can manage these coal closures without with the available resources. So that's good. But the bottom and underlying point about everything, Giles, the only thing in some ways that I think you need to understand, or the industry needs to understand, is that, Chris Bowen's reputation is going to rest on getting something that's credible in relation to the 80% by 2030 target. It doesn't have to be 80%. If it's like 70%, then and you can see 80%'s on the way, then we'll get there. And you're not going to get there unless you get those transmission and wind and solar projects built and commissioned. So unless you think he can't make that happen, and I don't think that. I think he can make it happen one way or another. It is going to happen.
How does he make it happen? Because the CEC investment report showed that zero for wind and just a few solar and battery hybrids, and of course battery storage. And we've seen another financial close, I think, just this week for another big battery. How do we make financial close happen, contracts written for those wind and solar farms?
Well, I think it's going to come through the CIS. As you said, and as I said previously, it's very obvious that unless they're absolutely forced to, AGL and Origin and Energy Australia are going to do as little as possible to assist the process. I'm not going to necessarily put on a hat and say that that's because they even want to keep their coal generators going necessarily. But the fact is that the only PPA or anything to do with wind or solar that AGL has done in the last 5 years and longer is Rye Park, and it only did that, you might argue, because it was a 20% shareholder in Tilt. Energy Australia, it's fair to say, has done something with Golden Plains stage 2.
Done an offtake agreement, yep.
Yeah, and Origin has done nothing at all. The last thing it did was Stockyard Hill, which was so long ago I can barely remember the name of it. And yet Origin's got Eraring closing in a couple of years, but it's announced zero in terms of what it's going to do to replace that energy. So the question is, why is that the case, right? Even if you think that they'd love to keep their coal generators going for as long as possible, it's still the case that Origin knows it's going to close Eraring, and it's got like 15 terawatt hours of energy, which requires 3 gigawatts minimum of 3 to 4 gigawatts, and it's not going to be the developer of that. It's not going to sign the PPAs unless it's forced to. It could be forced to with an REC scheme, but Tim Nelson was kind of warned off those, even though he loves them. So he's not going there, and so the reason is why, and the reason is possibly to do with the fact that when you sign a PPA, you're committing to pay a fixed price for electricity, but you're only receiving the spot price in the market. And I suspect that these generators have made an assessment that on average, that's a bad bet.
So who else is going to write contracts with them? There's not many big corporate
so the
customers
government
out there. The government is. Okay.
The government is. The CIS is. And the sooner that people realise that the CIS and whatever fancy-dancy thing the Nelson thing proposes that's even more complicated to replace it, is that trying to get those private sector guys involved and having to write contracts, that's the problem. They don't want to write the contracts.
So basically the prices for the CIS will have to go up to underwrite those things and get the finance.
Yes, why not go back to something approaching your vanilla contract for differences, CFD, the same as what we had in the ACT government or the Victorian government. Or we're going to get closer to that. That's my guess. Because the point is, that's what can happen, and that's what will happen if it has to happen.
Yeah, absolutely. And the ACT government was very successful in that, reaching its target of net 100% renewables. And I should remind people, with those big debates around the renewable energy target in the middle of the Abbott government, basically kept the wind and solar industry alive in Australia. So it was incredibly important what it did, and maybe that's the way to get over these lines now. Well, David, I can hear Checkers eating your carpet in the background, so I think we probably need to wind this podcast up pretty quickly. We had a really good long interview with Andrew, which was great. So and unless there's anything else to sort of suddenly announce or add.
Oh, no, it was great to see Australia Post announcing that they've got, 35 electric delivery trucks. That's great to go with their thousands of other electric vehicles, which it took me a couple of seconds to realise are mostly bicycles, but I'm still a great supporter.
Well, you've got to start somewhere.
They do. And look, that is the economic and efficient way to do it.
Yep, no, that's exactly right, yeah. Look, actually, just while we're on electric vehicles too, it's actually interesting seeing BHP sort of punt its big spending on mine electric vehicles and electric excavators and things like that into the 2030s, in sharp contrast to Fortescue. And yeah, so here we go. We've got Checkers back on screen. So welcome back, Checkers. Done enough of the carpet. David, thank you very much. Thanks for the great idea to have Andrew Walton on from Walton Advisory. Fantastic or fascinating to listen to the data center stuff. And we'll be back with another episode of the Energy Insiders podcast next week. Thanks to our sponsors, Evergen and Pylon. Do check out great interview on the Solar Insiders podcast about VPPs, and a really good interview on the Switched On podcast with Mark England from Ausgrid, seeking to sort of bend the rules and get permission to put in solar and sell it to the people. So, very interesting discussion there. Bye for now.
Energy Insiders was brought to you by Evergen, the market-leading renewable energy software business that optimises residential and commercial solar and battery systems. Evergen enables large numbers of systems to operate as a single fleet, so network operators can use them as a virtual power plant, generating significant value for consumers, network operators, and the energy system as a whole. Evergen software is powering the energy system of the future. Energy Insiders was also brought to you by Pylon. Pylon provides easy-to-use solar design software for installers and retailers with pay-as-you-go pricing, no monthly cost and no lock-in contracts. Join Australia's top solar companies who trust Pylon to design high-resolution, CEC-ready solar proposals.